Welcome to Get Centered. This is our summer episode, and I, being the acupuncturist who tends to discuss all things acupuncture and Chinese medicine and the nature of nature, wanted to be the first one to orient us to summertime. If you live in or around the Houston, Texas area, you are well aware that it is plenty hot outside. But of course, summer is related to the element of fire because of that heat, and it's related to the heart, and therefore it's related to the cardiovascular system, the small intestines or digestive fire, and the emotion of joy. And there are so many ways we talk about summer, fire, and heat colloquially, but we just don't really notice we're even saying it. So I'm going to run through a fun list of things that we talk about. We might say, if we are feeling particularly creatively generative, we might say, I'm on fire right now. We talk about, like I just mentioned, a digestive fire if we have a really good, strong gut. We talk about things being sexy as being hot. We know that if you have a red sports car, insurance is priced higher than if you have like a gray sedan. If you shoot a gun, we talk about firing a gun. If you get fired from a job, you're propelled into a new reality. We know that friction creates heat, whether that's sexy time friction or being in an argument and a disagreement, that heat that comes up. We say, oh my gosh, you look so angry, you could blow. And obviously we're referring to the heat and activity of a volcano. Think about how flexible your muscles and tendons and ligaments become when they're exposed to heat, as opposed to trying to do the same movements in a freezing cold room. So we know that physical, emotional, and social activity can raise our temperatures. So these things all illustrate the property of summer. And what I love is that we as a species are always saying, give me a sign, give me a sign. And these signs are literally all around us. We can tune into what's going on in nature and catch the wave and use the momentum of what a particular season is showing us out in nature and apply that to ourselves to be able to operate at our own optimal capacity. So summer, fire, and heat and joy, all these things are about growth, generativeness, transformation, movement, heat, brightness, climax, or apex. So we can remember back to chemistry, just basic chemistry. When a molecule is, if cold temperatures are added to that molecule, they slow down. And eventually, if it's cold enough, reaching freezing temperatures, that molecule stops moving altogether and we have something that's frozen. And conversely, when we add heat to that molecule, it starts moving faster and faster. And if we're talking about a liquid, right, it starts to reach boiling. The reason it's boiling is not just because it's hot and it boils. It's boiling because the molecules are jumping around. That's what the heat does to the molecule. So we need to kind of remember that basic building block of heat and cold, because you might remember in our wintertime episodes, we were talking about retreat, restore, calm down, contemplate, reflect. And you can look at it like, let me step back 1 second. The thing is that each season begets and generates the next season. So when we were talking about retreat, restore, take it easy in wintertime, we were saying that not just because that's what the season is asking us to do, but because when we move into the incoming season, we now are stronger and able to move into that next season more optimally. So you can look at it like what I was starting to say a second ago. If you need fuel in a car for it to go. So wintertime would be the time that you're actually filling the car with gas. Okay, and summer would be when you take that road trip. You can look at it like a water reservoir, because wintertime is the element of water. And when you can sort of tune into the signs that we were talking about of nature and go, oh, everything around me seems quite dormant, quite still, quite calm, quite dark. I'm going to wake up late and go to bed early. I'm going to be more contemplative, maybe journal more often rather than make plans socially. as often as I might in the summertime or spring, you're actually filling up that water reservoir so that when the next season comes, spring comes, and it's the time of birth, you have this full reservoir for watering all of the stuff that's starting to bloom and grow. And then because of that being a full season, you have stuff just generating and reaching its climax and apex in summer so that you have a beautiful harvest come late summer, early fall. So remembering that we're not just saying these things, these little bits of advice on how to operate in each season just for the sake of it. There's a really good reason. So each season of your life is better off or stronger because of the acknowledgement and the consciousness you brought to the season before it. So on a macro level, or that's really kind of macro seasonally, but then we can look at it one step closer to us as human beings and think, okay, well, this is a season of my life. Summer can be related to a season of life as opposed to winter being related to a season of life. So just for a general sense of understanding around this, when you're in utero, you're in a winter season. It's dark, it's quiet, it's calm, right? It's mysterious. And then when you're born into a spring. Something is being birthed or rebirthed, like we talked about in our Renaissance recording. And then summertime would be this very rapidly growing human, right? The bones are growing. We're accumulating knowledge and information constantly. So this first half of life could be considered the summer season of our lives. And so we're collecting in that season of our life, right? We're getting grades and awards and trophies and degrees and titles and nicknames and all of our ego orientation. Who am I as it relates to the way the world organizes people and puts them into categories? And the second half of life is quite the opposite, so whereas in the first half of life, I'm wondering who am I as it pertains to what other people think of me? What do I have? What am I doing? The second half of life would be more, I just am. I am. Whether you consider me that or not, or you want to give me a trophy or an award for it or not, it doesn't matter. And then on a micro level, we have just how are we in summer? How do we make the most of our summer season? So because of the things I mentioned right out of the gate, this heart organ, cardiovascular system, small intestine, digestive system, joy, relativity, we've got a recommendation for physical activity. Wake up early, go to bed late, but maybe take a little break in the hottest part of the day, in the middle of the day. You're taking advantage of the brightness that there is, the length of the day. You have more diet flexibility so that you can expand your diet in the wintertime. We're asking you, you've heard us before say, please, not the cold foods in wintertime, have warm stews and so forth. Summertime, watermelon, cucumber, smoothies, sushi, salads, all of it. That's on the menu again. Make plans and be social. It's tricky because of COVID. Just use your own discretion. If it has to be a Zoom social activity, just put your feelers out there and start to reconnect if you've been hibernating. And the final thing I want to say is we all know that fires can rage out of control, or there may sometimes even not even be a spark to even light a fire. And if you find yourself as somebody who's like, oh gosh, all these recommendations for summer, I don't feel like I've got it in me, that means that you probably have a deficiency in this heart organ. And acupuncture can help you with that. Okay, we've got to have a fire to even light in the first place. And if you feel like, I feel like this all the time, I can't even sleep at night, I'm in summer all the time, that probably means you have too much fire. We need to pour a little bit of water onto that fire. And so what I'm trying to say is that acupuncture, psychotherapy, mindfulness, all of these things can kind of help us stay in that nice contained space for fire, because we need it, but we just don't want none, and we don't want too much. So I'm curious to know what each of you thinks of all of this.
Thanks so much, Lila Scott. That was great. And what I thought What immediately I went to in sort of my line as a Jungian analyst working with clients is that the idea of heat and heart being so much more associated with emotion and with feeling, of course. And what happens so much in the psychotherapy world is that we get stuck in our head and think that we can think our way through problems or through situations or through trauma. And to me, as you were explaining that, the idea of hot and cold is perfect, that the ideas and the concepts are necessary, but they are more cold, something like that. And the necessity of heating up the body, heating up food for consumption, transformation, all that stuff, needs the right amount of heat for the emotional component. And so the thinking of our logical mind and our emotional selves as hot and cold, to me, feels like a really helpful analogy.
Conceptually, I imagine we can all grasp, what it means to be too hot or not have enough heat. Could you speak about diagnostically what you're looking for when you're looking for too much heat or not enough heat?
Emotionally, too much heat or heart heat in particular would be what looks like mania. And not enough at all would look like depression. So that would be an emotional example of what that looks like diagnostically. There's all kinds of digestive ways that we could look at it. People may not want to hear it right now, but
You're going to talk about poop, right?
Yes. And here's a way to kind of put it as nicely as I can think of at the moment. Nothing's TMI for me, but I'm just trying to be sensitive to other people. If you can imagine a dumpster that's outside and it's wintertime, okay, so all kinds of food scraps are in it, but it's really cold outside, it's not going to emit much of an odor, right? However, if it's summertime, same things are in that dumpster, you're going to walk by it and just, oh my God, right? It's like a completely different experience, same ingredients. That temperature is what was different. So that goes on in our digestive system, right? So we're looking at the bowels in all kinds of ways, smell being one of them. Of course, we use things like tongue and pulse, because heat has an element of quickness to it. If somebody's pulse is particularly rapid, we're going to consider a heat syndrome. If their tongue is bright red, red being the color of heat, fire, right? It's going to be bright red.
I still want to talk about poop, though.
You do?
Yeah, because here's why. I mean, because I'm married to you, I've been initiated into this awareness. But I think that as you were talking about that, it's funny. Like, rarely are you asked by. I mean, I just had a physical, and not one question. I got a good doctor, right? Not one question about poop. Mm-hmm. And we watched this really cool documentary recently called "Kiss the Soil." Mm-hmm. Wasn't that the one where they were talking?
Kiss the dirt. I think
Kiss the dirt. Yeah. Your dumpster, of course, I think about our composting and kind of what's necessary for the like really rich, fertile soil. And who was it? It was Patricia Arquette that said, "Keep poop in the loop."
Yeah.
And, I can, of course, like go off for 2 hours probably right now thinking about what it means that we don't like to talk about shit. Yeah. Because psychologically that means we're not wanting to look at excrement. We're not looking, but ironically, that's exactly what makes fertilizer. And so our culture is built around separating this stuff and treating it as opposed to integrating it. And mm-hmm. I think when it comes to your physician, whether it's a Chinese practitioner, a traditional Chinese medicine, or anybody else, to not even educate somebody about the quality of their poop is a mistake. Mm-hmm. And psychologically, we all do something therapeutic regarding our psychology. When somebody isn't ready to look at their shit, as we say colloquially, right? That's not a good sign, right? That's a sign that there are a lot of denial aspects. There's a lot of repression going on. There's an anxiety about the nature of nature. And so I want to push this point a little bit just because I like it. And it's like, oh, of course that matters. And it's diagnostic. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different kinds of poop.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. There definitely are. And it's comical when people come in and they're like, I'm so sorry, I don't mean to gross you out. I'm like, are you kidding me? I love this stuff. But your example of the compost and keeping poop in the loop is such a good one. I mean, when we were starting our own compost pile, I remember being advised, be careful not to have it too close to a fence because this will start a fire. You know what I mean? And you can stick your hand down in there and it is burning up, burning up. It requires so much heat for that transformation and breakdown to occur. And then of course, like this is a whole nother thing, but the other important piece is that microbiome that goes on inside the excrement, right? And so all the reason that heat is there is because it's alive, it's filled. I was reminded recently, we've talked about this before, but I've never had really an exact percentage and as close as we can get, right? But we're 1% human, 1% human, 99% other
Everything
creatures.
else.
Everything else.
Yeah.
That's bacteria, viruses, all of it. It's just amazing. Which I'll think of the list of things that we say, and we don't even really realize that we're talking about the nature of nature in our human experience.
Those are our metaphors.
I was thinking about anger specifically as like blow your top or whatever. You're gonna explode, right? It's like a fire. But I think it does feel also hot when you're angry, right? Like you might say hot and bothered or whatever, right? They're like they're hot. Like, oh, he's hot. He's gonna don't go with it. Leave him alone. And I'm thinking about how we work with anger as an indicator of something potentially underneath that. Because for me, I'm aware in myself that generally if I'm angry, it's because if I can peel back the layer enough and to look at what's, the excrement of it, the part I really don't want to look at, it's kind of like, oh, I might be scared. Right. And right. Or ashamed or something like that. Right. And those may be so uncomfortable for me that I would rather transform them into some other hot thing that I can like hopefully get it out or whatever, right? Instead of sitting with it and being with it and feeling it, I may want to transform it into anger because at least that feels more active maybe than passive, like passively experiencing fear. Oh, no, I don't like that. At least I'll be active. I'll be angry. I'm thinking about the what's underneath, like what's under the engine, what's in the ground level of all this. And I'm curious what your experience is when you hear somebody come in and say like, oh, I've just been really angry lately, or I was so angry. And what are you looking for in terms of in the body to see?
Yeah. Well, anger kind of, it's not that it doesn't involve the heart, right? We're all one thing. So it's all involved, but anger and irritability in particular, we tend to look more toward like liver, gallbladder, but in particular, the fear aspect that you mentioned is interesting to know that the heart and the kidney have a very, very close relationship in Chinese medicine as they do in Western medicine. And so because there's this very tight feedback loop, you can imagine that if the kidneys and adrenal glands are firing up with fear, that heat rises. It rises in a house, it rises in your body, it goes up and it hits the heart starts pumping, and then you have that similar feeling you do of something like of anger, right? Like that same hot mania, like I'm just going to blow type thing we were talking about before. So it's all certainly related. Also, anger, liver, gallbladder, that's the wood element, which just precedes the fire element. And so if we have, right, this is kind of getting, I don't want to say messed up, but backed up, it can then affect, it goes into the next one. Which one is this circular for y'all? So wood, fire, right? So it goes wood leads into fire. You burn wood to get fire. Fire leads to earth, ashes lead to earth, earth generates metal, metal contains water, water nourishes wood. So it's this whole engendering cycle. And there's a whole control cycle as well, but we don't have time for that at the moment.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're saying also that there is an element of like, when I get to fire, I may also like take one step back on the loop and say, okay, where's the wood? Like
Yes.
maybe there's too much wood here or whatever, right? Too
Yeah.
much wood at
Or
once.
not enough water, right? We use water to control the fire.
Right. Wow.
Thanks everybody for being here for this opener to our summer season, and look forward to what's to come. This is your first half of life season, so go out there, be active, make the most of it.
All right, folks, we are gearing up for round 2 in our summer series here, our first step on our Get Centered for the season. I'm going to talk about a portion of our development. When we were discussing what to explore through this process, I immediately went to our early childhood development, certainly as it relates to our second half of life, something that Jung articulated really well, first half of life and second half of life. And I want to look at a couple of slides as we go. And this first slide is delineating the structure and dynamics of the psyche. And what Jung did, certainly that Freud did, but what Jung did is broke the psyche into 3 different levels. There's consciousness, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. And throughout our lives, certainly throughout the first half of life, we are developing a self. And the self is in relationship to the culture or to the collective or to the environment. And at first, a lot of psychoanalytic theories talk about this fusion of the individual with the environment, because there is no self, not in the Buddhist sense of no self, but there's no formed ego. And so what Jung was really articulating is that through this process of development that involves our biology, our psychology, our emotions, our interpersonal life, and these archetypes that he talked about. Now, in this structure of the psyche, the contents of consciousness is the ego. This is this storied narrative of who I am. It's the organ of orientation. The personal unconscious is full of what he called complexes that are these feeling-toned, historically based splinter personalities that manifest when we are, quote, triggered, or we're just living out some agenda. The collective unconscious is full of what he called the archetypes. These are powers and forces that are seemingly outside of human consciousness, yet human consciousness is beholden to these various patterns. This is what in the Greek pantheon, for example, the archetypes are populating the pantheon. These are eternal forces that we're beholden to, and they take certain form. For example, we all need to be mothered or fathered. That doesn't mean we have to have a mother and a father, but we have these energy fields that are represented in our lives. And if we don't have those energy fields represented, we will search it in some kind of other container. So what Jung, I want to jump here now into this image that I've talked about before, which is this path of individuation. So looking through the stages of development, you have a first half of life. Leela Scott mentioned it earlier. We have the adaptation to outer conditions. It's achievement-based, and we're essentially oriented to forming our sense of identity, who we are in the world. And as Leela Scott said, something I really liked, which was each stage prepares you for the next stage. And so if I don't have a healthy container of an identity of who I am in my first stage of life, the second half of life is going to be pretty difficult. So we don't need to go into it, but you can imagine, of course, what happens in the second half of life when we don't have a solid identity from the first. As we're transitioning from this formation period, there's typically some kind of a disturbance in the force. There's a crisis, there's a destabilizing experience, and it rocks the boat of those adaptations. And in the best of times, what it does is it shakes loose authentic parts of the individual that had to be sacrificed in order to assimilate to an environment that probably had ideas of who it wanted you to be more than who you wanted to be. And that's going to create enormous conflict. Back to Jung, you might not be conscious of the conflict, but you will see it in various symptoms that manifest on the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual level. And of course, the second half of life, which we won't get into totally today, but just quickly, what happens in the second half of life is we have an adaptation to inner conditions and values. We begin to recollect fragments of our past that we had to drop. You may find somebody who's all of a sudden singing when they had to drop that, or being an artist because the family system said, "Oh, no, do that. You can't make any money." But now you're 50 and you're just, all you want to do is paint or dance. The identity is resituated in relationship to this deeper part of self. And there's some recognition about how you've been taken for a ride that wasn't really authentically based in your own desires and needs. What Jeff Kripal does, he's a friend, he's a religious scholar. He says the human being is two. And if you'll look at this slide, what you see are three icons from three different religious traditions. The Star of David, what you'll see are two triangles that are interwoven together, and there's a tension inherent in the dual dynamic. There's a cross, which is an intersection point between two vectors. Then there's the yin and the yang, which is, of course, a tension held between two opposites. And what I like about the yin and the yang, of course, is that there's a little bit of each and the other. I think that is probably one of the most beautiful and profoundly powerful symbols that we might have. Jeff says each human being is two. That is, each person is simultaneously a conscious constructed self or socialized ego and a much larger, complexly conscious field that normally manifests only in non-ordinary states of consciousness and energy, which the religion traditions have historically objectified, mythologized, and projected outward into the sky as divine or as God, or introjected inward into the human being as nirvana, Brahman, or located in some sort of experienced paradoxical state that is neither inside or outside, as in the Chinese Tao or the American paranormal. So what Jeff starts to understand is, to look at, is that what we don't consciously own in ourselves is projected outside of ourselves and will be in relationship to it out there in the form of maybe a hero, in the form of a lover, in the form of an idealized other figure, in the form of an institution. And we'll take all those parts of ourselves that we don't realize. This is not an intellectual knowing. This is, we don't embody the fact that that is in fact our life. So it's projected out into the world. So essentially, this is Joseph Campbell's model of the psyche, which I think does a really good job of looking at these layers of consciousness. And if you'll notice, the top level is looking at the idea of transcendence. The arched figure is the sun door. There's nature or moral laws. The temple represents the institutionalization of morality and social customs, and the people represent the neighbors, like what will the neighbors think? So that's our world. That's our environment that's pushing on our identity and forming us. And it needs to happen. It doesn't need to be vilified. This is natural nature. And there's a cost. And the cost, as this image really identifies, is that all those unconscious aspects are then related with in nature, animals, others. So the quote from Jung that I love very much is, when it comes to being in relationship with this cycle or process of adaptation, I quoted this from Jung, volume 18, paragraph 1087 and 1089. In neurosis, the adaptation process is disturbed, or rather we might say that the neurosis itself is a disturbed or diminished process of adaptation that takes two basic forms. One, the disturbance of adaptation to the outer conditions, or two, the disturbance of adaptation to the inner conditions. Similarly, we also need to look at two different and fundamental situations, right? The adaptation to the outer condition is disturbed because the subject tries to adapt entirely and exclusively to the outside, while entirely neglecting the inside, thereby upsetting the balance of the act of adaptation. Two, the disturbance arises from a preferential adaptation to the inside. Equally, adaptations to the inner conditions can be disturbed in two ways: by an exclusive adaptation to the outside, or by neglect of the outside in favor of the adaptation to the inside. So this is important because we start to differentiate the nature, of our human nature. And what we can do is look at our early development and healthy development and recognize that, number one, we aren't all raised perfectly. And in fact, one thing that Jung said that I love very much was that I don't wish the perfect parent on anybody. In fact, we're going to be wounded based upon the dynamics, right? We all carry various wounds. And so unfortunately, it's not, are you affecting your child? It's, how are you? Because you definitely are. The point is to be conscious of how those various adaptations affected your development, affected that first half of life, and formed the idea, right? Again, because the ego is a story creating organ, affected the idea of who you know yourself to be, which then affects your perceptions and your behaviors and your mental formations. And you live those out as if they are reality. But one thing we do know about reality is reality isn't reality. Reality is your understanding of reality based upon your history. So what happens in our first half of life is this form, is this idea. Now we're in summer, so we're going to talk about how this is formed, right? We're not going into not necessarily going fully into the second half of life. We'll do this in later series, But first and foremost, we need to look at and identify the ways in which our idea of who we are is created in our first half of life relative to our biological, social, emotional, and spiritual upbringing. And then we can get little indicators on how those formations might not be totally aligned with the real essence of who we are, which we would call soul. And I do want to define that for a second from Thomas More. Soul is the invisible, mysterious, and softly radiant element that infuses your being and makes you human. Like plasma in your veins, it gives you a sense of meaning, feeling, connection, and depth. And a lot of times what we treat are folks who feel stale or stagnant. You know, Leela Scott talked about fire, and I'll finish just after this thought. Leela Scott talked about fire, and I, of course, a lot of the Christian formations of hell involve hell being this fiery pit. And Henri Corbin, this writer of religion, he writes, I think very beautifully, he says, hell is not fire. Fire is transformative. Hell is frozen. It's when we become fixed. It's when we become stuck. And one of the most common things for the psychotherapist, at least in my office, that most people feel stuck. They've tried all kinds of approaches. They've tried everything from sex, drugs, and rock and roll to wellness and reading and swimming and exercise, but they keep doing what they've always done. The act of therapy involves a deep reflective experience with another human being in a context of trust to begin to help articulate who it is you truly are as your soul is speaking. And so the fire piece is, we got to go out there, we got to form our space, we got to achieve. But just like with the sun, Leela Scott says this a lot, the sun casts a shadow. So something's left out. And part of our work is about reclaiming what is left out in the process. And I'll leave it there for right now.
I'm curious what the conflicts are. I'm curious, like, what are the inward, outward conflicts that can arise as a result of this kind of shaking loose process that you talked about, and coming back to, you know, identifying the parts of you that you may have sacrificed or left behind in this youth phase?
It's a great question. So I tend to really like the model of one of my, I think, central academic, scholarly, and spiritual perspectives, as Ariel, as you and I discussed from, you know, our first date, is that there is a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual aspect to reality. So anytime we want to look at conflicts, we want to pay attention to those various areas. And when somebody comes in, I'm really listening to what's in the foreground. And I'm beginning to hold what's in the background too. I'm beginning to theorize what might be going on back here. And that's when I start doing the work of interpretation, because I'm trying to draw their attention to these patterns that just by the nature of our consciousness, they're not aware of. I mean, let's just think physiologically. I'm not aware of my heartbeat right now until I say it. Now I am. Now you are, right? I'm not aware of the seat on my ass or my ass on my seat. Now I am. Now you are. That's a decent indicator of what is conscious or unconscious or just beneath consciousness. So when somebody comes in, I'm paying attention to, I mean, the crudest answer, I think, is just listening to outer world, inner world. Is it a pattern in their relationships? Is it a pattern in their history? Is it a pattern of the way in which they're thinking and perceiving their reality? Of course, all these things are interwoven, right? There's no real way that we can separate a person's biology from their spirituality. We think we can, but we can't. Things get really fucked up when we start doing that. So what we want to do is listen for how we get the entry point. And most commonly, I would say the conflicts are some kind of family system issue. They have some kind of surrogate that they're seeking in the form of addiction or the form of relationships. There are patterns of thinking. What I encounter a lot of times when I push on somebody a little bit is they'll start kind of just calling out, like, I don't think I can do that, you know? And then it's like, well, let's look at that belief pattern, because we have these unconscious limiting beliefs that influence how we see the world. And I love William Blake for this one, because William Blake says, I see through the eye and not with it. But oftentimes we see with our eye. We believe that our perception is the world, and it's not. We can look at it, and that's the point of, I think, the relational dynamic in psychotherapy, is that you're able to totally expose yourself and mine through the contents, because most of the time you're regulating, you're socially monitoring, you're being tense. Am I liked? Do you like me? Am I looking like I'm this, that, or the other? Do I look confident? Do I look cool? Do I look effective? Do I look valuable? Am I a person who is of potency? That's the kind of shit that we're talking about all the time. And so when what I recommend for people is to not edit. And if you can come in and actually take me up on that, it's a pretty radical experience to be with another person and unedited. And then you really get to look at some of those things that you tend to repress and suppress most of the time. I hope that got to your question, Ariel.
Yeah, I guess I was curious in terms of the family systems. What does it shake loose when somebody starts to individuate? You know, as the person who's doing it, I'm talking about myself a little bit, but it's like, you know, as you start to be yourself, the systems around you sort of go, whoa.
They get pissy. Yeah.
Hey, what are you doing over here?
Yeah, I know you're not doing the thing that we agree.
What's with the beard? Or, you know,
it always comes down to the beard, man.
Just like in terms of just expecting that in some way is already some of the healing, just to know, okay, I'm changing. This may bring stuff up for other people who assume I'm going to be a certain way. It seems like there's a wisdom in that, just knowing it.
Yeah, there is. And I do, Jim Hollis has a great quote about how the family system or the institution is consistently asking the individual to make sacrifices of their soul, because what it seeks is compliance and obedience and identification with the collective norm. And what we're talking about is a process of not only being in collectivity, but paradoxically also being an individual. And that sets up a really difficult structure for us, because in a dualistic dynamic, which we're totally in, it's very difficult to walk the line of paradox and ambiguity. And so we're kind of called, there's an old Zen saying that says, if it's not paradox, it's not true. And so trying to actually put yourself in a state of holding the opposites and holding the paradox. I am both an individual and I am collective. I am both biological and I am spiritual. I am both an ant that is just trying to like grow my colony, and I'm also divine, and I'm trying to connect deeply and express my soul. You know, and that I think is what's socialized out of us a bit. And Aldous Huxley talked about the major problem of that is overpopulation. You know, because the more we get overpopulated, and then the more the culture pushes upon us to be a certain way.
I want to chime in just for a little bit and just think about how it's sort of in us naturally that we know on some level that first half of life is about taking. You know, we've been given life force, right? The egg and the sperm came together and created a new life. And we know it's like when we're in the womb, we're taking from mom, right? And then we're taking from life. We're accumulating. And sometimes we take things that we weren't maybe supposed to take because we're confused, right? We don't have a lot of orientation around this. Our parents didn't know the things that we have charged ourselves with learning, right? Like we're all here trying to, on some level, drop what didn't work in the generations before so that we don't pass them to the next generation. But when you are a little one and you're just programmed to take everything around you, you're taking what's good, but you're also taking what doesn't work, right? And I'm thinking of this also simultaneously, John, you alluded to it, like the sun casts a shadow. And we've said it before, how sort of the perfect, other than the Tai Chi symbol, that the perfect yin yang imagery is a mountain, and the sun is shining on one side of the mountain. So this is lit up and this is in the darkness still. But we also have to relate it to that there's an uphill climb and then there's a descent. So there's this combination of accumulating, climbing, effort, right? And then you get to the top and go, oh my God, I don't know that I want half the stuff that I've gotten, whether it's a belief system or a habit or a title or whatever, a relationship, you know, and then you start walking down that mountain, shedding the stuff. And hopefully, right, like we need assistance. We need people like what we do, right? People who are trained in these kinds of awarenesses to help each other, initiate each other into the second half of life, and to begin that descent. And like you said, people around us don't love it if they're not doing it too.
Yeah, and we have a lot of, if I had more time, I would have really gone into shadow a lot more. And I think Gia and I were talking about, you know, the hate crimes that are happening, but certainly, I mean, just collectively, um, and what that is I mean, just to be reductive for a second, because it's a total reduction. I know it's more complex than this, but on some level, what happens is that somebody's otherness, which is essentially a way of saying somebody's different, we're so invested in doubling down on our own understanding of reality because the ego is destabilized when its familiarity is poked at. So if I have one of those weakened egos from my first half of life and I see an other, and it enrages me because I'm not content in me. I'm not content in my own identity, that just the existence of an other is a repository for all of that unconscious insecurity, of violence and aggression, a sense of being scared in the world because I don't have a strong base. That's projected out into the world of the other. And then the fantasy that violence to an other will somehow satisfy what is destabilized. But as we all know, that doesn't work. So this dynamic it's very important in our first half of life to experience love, connection, reflection, attunement, space, solitude, right? Excitement and enthusiasm for you, for who you are and who you're becoming. And if we don't experience that, our container is shaky. And the fact of the matter is, we're not able to go, oh, my container's shaky, because my favorite image for this one is the fish that's in water that jumps out of the water, looks down and says, oh, that's what that stuff is. It doesn't know it until it gets out of itself. But if you are so invested in sameness, you never get to see out of your waters. And so what you do is perpetuate your desire to have other people look like you, other people behave like you, other people do what you do, because your difference makes that individual's ego very uncomfortable. And so I think sometimes I can get on a soapbox here, but I think it's very important for us to look at this, because what we're seeing in the polarity, in the politicization of our political landscape and our collective, of the religious issues, of the racial issues, of the sexuality issues, I mean, just name it. What we're seeing is a faulty ground, a faulty identity of people who have been connected with to feel content in who they are and in their own soul, erupting out and imagining that you need to take out that sense of insecurity on the representation of your inner lack. You project that onto somebody that represents where you lack, what you may not even know you lack. This is a typical dynamic where you see somebody who's totally homophobic that enacts some kind of violence on gay people, where usually when we look at somebody that's doing this, it's like they're absolutely disconnected from their own emotional life, from their own feeling center, from their own sense of intimacy and how they get and receive intimacy and connection. Okay, well, there's more to come here on this one. Thanks for being here. Round 2 on Get Centered, where we talk about first half of life and summer, and certainly check out Gia, who's coming up next, going to talk about play.
Welcome to Get Centered. This is our summer series, part 3, I guess, and I'll be covering play for today. So kind of, if you watched part 2, John specifically spoke about a lot about the first half of life, and that's kind of the direction that I'm going to, but I'm also going to incorporate the second half of life. So it's going to be from a child's point of view, and also a adult's perspective on play. I think I nerded out a little bit on the adult section of it a little bit more, so there's going to be a lot more stats coming through for you. And specifically for the children's portion, just kind of going over again the benefits that play has developmentally for our kids, but also for adults. So essentially, play is the most important aspect of both the child's life and adult's life as well. First and foremost, I'm going to focus on the child section first. So a lot of people ask why. Why is play important? Because through like peekaboo, patty cake, Ariel mentioned slide before, and playing with Legos, kids learn to think creatively and interact socially. It helps essentially develop their physically and discover a slew of emotional skills, and helps them learn how to process and understand the world a lot better. Overall, it also encourages children to develop cognitively, physically, socially, and emotionally, which I'll explain a little bit more in just a second. In simpler terms, it helps our kids to kind of create a foundation for learning, exploring, problem solving, and building not only an understanding of the world, but also themselves. So that they can carry that into the world. So if we're thinking about it cognitively, how does it benefit it? So essentially, play promotes healthy development and critical thinking skills. It helps to really reinforce one's memory, to understand cause and effect, and to be able to explore the world and their role in it. It helps to use their senses and encourages exploration and curiosity. A good question is, when was the last time, as an adult, we explored ourselves curiously? The physical benefits, physically it helps in the fine and gross motor skills. With the motor development, encourages movement, understanding of spatial relations, promotes the planning processes of our motor skills as well, and supports balance and dexterity. So obviously examples of this, just simply running, jumping, swimming, block building, dancing, kind of anything active that you can really think of. It will kind of fall under the physical benefits of play. And then the social aspect of it is, it helps kind of kids learn how to interact with others. um, it creates an understanding of social expectations and rules. We might not always follow them because, screw some of those rules, because society has dictated, what we should and shouldn't do. But obviously there is a set standard that we should still kind of go by, to not do anything, I guess, dangerous. But essentially, when what happens is, play provides opportunities to help us share thoughts and ideas, to listen and to compromise. And the last aspect of this is the emotional benefits. So, when a child loses a game, for example, they learn how to process the sadness, anger, grief, working through just how unfair things are, in the process, that they couldn't win or they didn't get the piece that they wanted. It helps build confidence and encourages the development of their own identity and self-esteem, and how they can learn to share and interact, while also bringing their emotions and awareness to it. Now, here's my kind of nerding out part of the adult portion of this. So, as a lot of us know, the benefits of play are far reaching. I think a lot of us often give up play as adults for a lot more serious pursuits, like our careers, our relationships, families. These are all valid pursuits. But, if we could tap into play to kind of enhance our life experiences, our professions, our relationships, again, and our family lives as adults, why don't we? I think play for adults is critical in our stressful, like, on the go lives, and it's shown to release, so nerding out part, the endorphins, which creates and improves brain functionality, stimulates creativity, and it helps to keep us young and feeling energetic. Why not stay young forever, right? So studies show that play improves memory and stimulates the growth of cerebral cortex, and it's shown to trigger the secretion of BDNF. BDNF essentially in simpler terms, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a substance essential for the growth of brain cells. I think I gravitated more towards the workplace, but again, this applies to, stay-at-home moms, individuals who own their own companies, or just remote workers, especially with COVID and what we faced this past year and a half. So over the last couple of decades and years even, there's been such a strong emphasis on play at work. So instead of just working, a lot more companies have started to embrace a play in the workplace. We've come to see the benefits of creative play in the office, which allows for exponential development and initiation of like, hey, I'm actually looking forward to work. So a lot of companies have kind of thrown in many different things at the wall just to see kind of what sticks and what can improve productivity in their workers. Yet creating more playful workplaces isn't a guarantee that your organization will be magically better, because some companies may feel like they want to manage forced fun, and sometimes that can kind of backfire on what we're hoping to get out of a more playful workplace. So some of the research that I found is that play at work is linked to less fatigue, boredom, stress, burnout in individual workers, but also workers as a group. It's positively associated with job satisfaction, sense of competency, and creativity. The results also show that when a participant receives a task that is presented more playfully, they are more involved and spend more time on the task. Teams of workers can benefit from play via increased trust, bonding, social interaction, sense of solidarity, and decreased sense of hierarchy. I think that's why a lot of companies have icebreakers in the first place, just to kind of get everyone acclimated to the environments. So findings suggest that like play at work can benefit whole organizations by creating just a friendlier work atmosphere, higher commitment to work, again, more flexible organization-wide decision making, so everyone has somewhat of a say in certain projects and things that they are very interested in. From a study from Bright HR, which is an HR cloud software company, they created a study called It Pays to Play. 79% of, and this was a study in 2017, sorry if I didn't mention that, but 79% of the people that just recently graduated or left school for some reason really truly believe that fun at work is important, with 44% of this group believing it increases and encourages hard work ethic. And then this can kind of be argued from generationally too, because there might be a different perspective. So I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit because there is a lot to cover. I read through a book called Play: How It Shapes the Brain, Opens the Imagination, and Invigorates the Soul from Dr. Stuart Brown. I read this a while ago. He actually created the 8 play personalities. So the Joker, the Kinesthete, the Explorer, the Competitor, the Director, the Collector, the Artist / creator, and the storyteller. Now he says that you can have multiple play personalities. This isn't like being introverted or extroverted, where most people unfortunately like to pick one or the other. We might find that you have several things that you do that gravitate towards a number of play personalities. Your own specific play personality can change over the span of your life. It's kind of like, I don't know if y'all have ever done the love languages quiz, where the way you receive and offer love may change over the course of time. Perhaps you were more of a competitor in your younger years, but as the years went by, you became more of a collector. Perhaps you had children and you moved away from collecting and back into competing, or more into the Joker category. And like the third aspect was various things that you do for play can fall under multiple categories. For example, what you can have done to improve comedy since, late a few years back, that easily can fall under the Joker play personality or the storyteller play personality. different forms of play for adults, or archetypes that that Dr. Brown has created is, the rough and tumble play, ritual play, imaginative play, body play, and object play. I think it's just a matter of us exploring what fits best for us, but also carving out that time to incorporate that, because things will come up, family will come up, relationships will come up, work will come up, but to actively carve out a time to incorporate these things might be a little bit harder, but the overall, over time, you can really see the benefits. Again, keeping us young and energetic, and releasing the endorphins that we need to reduce the stress and anxiety that may build up from our day to day. I hope that this has helped inform y'all more on play, and I hope, after this rainy weather we have in Houston here, that all of us can go out today and have some fun.
Do you have recommendations for ways to get started with play if you're kind of like, maybe you're just like, really stopped playing and you're just like trying to find just a beginning?
I mean, I definitely for kids, I've already written 2 articles that you can check out on the center website. And that's,
yeah, we'll link it below.
Link it below. And then for adults, I think that the process is just, pen to paper. You know how we do little sketches on notebooks whenever we're either listening to a podcast or just doing something random? Just kind of sketch. That's a form of creative play that I like to interpret. But it's, if we think about it, I bought a box of Jacks the other day, just because I was like, this is very nostalgic, and I think that people, not only this current generation, but also all the generations that are here on this recording, also. We kind of have a sense of going back to things that make us feel nostalgic. I was like, hey, that was like super awesome. Even if it's like we're taking a stick outside and we're just drawing in the dirt, or we used to like find roly-polies in the ground and we're like, hey, that's pretty cool. So it can manifest in any way, as long as it's, I think it's taking us out of an element that applies too much expectations for ourselves, because kind of like John was talking about before, maybe taking ourselves out of the normal societal expectations of what's expected of us. Because I think a lot of even people that I've spoken with is just like, I don't want to be embarrassed by people from my own generation or older generations, because there's an expectation of me to be a certain way, to make sure I make sure everyone else is okay, make sure things are kind of in order. But then that kind of leaves out the play part. And so I think, whatever kind of draws us out of just some of those societal expectations and norms and stuff can really help us then engage and be mindful that, hey, like, let's just, relax, do something that's out of the ordinary or just makes us feel good.
Personally, as a kid, I was a tree climber. And then when I discovered the Texas Rock Gym, oh my God, it was like fireworks. I was so excited to climb again. And, but what I'm hearing is that a commitment to adult play is a commitment to ourselves, because everything else, right? It's everything else about adult life can really be about commitment to everyone and everything else. It's like, do this, satisfy that, make sure this person's taken care of, and so I don't want to use the word discipline, right? Because that's kind of a storied word, but like, if we think of it as a commitment, that feels so much more approachable. And when you were talking about the first half of life play stuff, I couldn't help but think of, I forget exactly when it happened, but there was that shooting at University of Texas many years ago from the tower above. And I listened to an interview about his upbringing, and the neighbors reported that he was not allowed to play, this person. His parents would literally interrupt any form of play was not allowed to play. And look what happened. You know, all the things that you were saying, that the importance of childhood play, like, oh my God. And then I was thinking about a book that I read. It was that Easy to Love, Difficult to Discipline book that I've talked about so much. And she talks about in there, you know, a minimum of 15 minutes a day of doing child guided play. And I thought to myself, 15 minutes, I think it was even 5 to 15 minutes. Think how little that is. That's like nothing. The rule thing, learning the rules. And sometimes we have to break the rules, and we figure out we get in trouble if we break the rules. And that can be dangerous. And then as we get a little older, we realize that the consequences are higher when I break the rules, and that feels even more dangerous. And I don't like the way that feels, and I want to follow the rules. And when I follow the rules, now school is not about play. School is about sitting still and being quiet. It's the opposite of play. So I better not step out of line. And now I'm an adult who's terrified to draw outside the lines, to play, to do anything but what I'm supposed to do. And how stiffened and frozen we can become in that place. And I think, you know, Ariel, jumping back to your question about like, how do you even know as an adult, what do you do to play? I think Jay is exactly right. Like, what did you do as a kid? Did you go find roly-polies? Did you climb trees? Did you play an instrument? What did you do? Go do that again, you know?
Yeah, I think the necessity of it is also conditioned out of us a bit with our school system, with our culture. I mean, you know, play is the verb we use for a musical instrument. And if we look at school things, you know, the hard sciences are important, and something that is play is optional and not as important. And so I think we're taught that it isn't, but inevitably, you know, like Gio was saying, as adults, when something is stuck and too frozen in place, that's exactly what we need to loosen it up and to get in touch with some of that youthful enthusiasm and playfulness that partially then it becomes out of our comfort zone, but partially, you know, societally was conditioned out of us. I think we also have to see that, you know, there are a lot of societal forces that actually discourage that kind of play, because it doesn't fit on a spreadsheet necessarily. But the importance is tremendous. You know, just like Joe was mentioning in terms of other benefits. But I also don't like to talk about it in terms of other benefits, like when you talk about music is good because it makes you better at math. It's like, no, music is good because music is good. Yeah. You know, it's important on its own for us as human beings, and to see ourselves as more multifaceted.
Break the rules, break the rules.
I think like the other question that like popped up for me while I was doing this is, you know, whether it be parents or guardians, you know, it seems as though, you know, we're teaching our kids to grow up too fast because of all the scheduled activities and expectations of making grades. But does society teach us how to play as a component of, you know, creative thinking, all the other realms that it goes down towards?
I don't remember it being actively taught, right? I remember like, you know, it was like recess time and they're like, okay, bye, go play. All right, everybody go out. And you're out there and it's like the Wild West. You're like, whoa, you're like, what do I do now? Like, and then the only issue they would correct is if you were, you know, in conflict, or you were kind of like not playing correctly, right? Mm-hmm. You pulled the toy out of somebody else's hand. If they cried, then it was a problem. Otherwise it might be fine. But it's interesting. I in what you and Rodney have talked about, I'm thinking about like, and there's a tendency even in myself. I'm like, okay, so let me put play into my spreadsheet. I'm like, okay, fine. So I'm gonna put play into my calendar, and like, okay, so there's a way in which we can use the structure,
yes,
to give us the support to do the play, as long as we're not like, okay, now I'm gonna go and I'm gonna take out my markers and I'm gonna sit here and scribble. I'm gonna set my timer for 15 minutes. And I'm going to color for 15 minutes until I've played properly.
Well, I like the comment. I'm putting a couple things together. I like what you're saying really about scheduling, because at first I was like, oh, schedule, but then I immediately thought about like a band practice, and you pick like we're going to jam in the key of A, or sex. Like I recommend to people all the time to schedule sex with your partner. Like what you do during that time is up to you guys, but to actually state that there's going to be a space that's designated for this kind of unordered time. And so whether it's music or sex or art, there's a reason why those things are connected with a possibility of the divine, because you're not forcing it, you're not controlling something is moving through you. You are a vessel for some kind of expression that's not so linear and literal, but more expressive and symbolic. And yes, of course, all those things Gia's talking about, whether it's, you can learn a lot faster when you're playful. You can communicate a lot better when you're playful. All this, when you're pissed off and agitated, right? All that goes out the window. Learning too, like you can't acquire new knowledge when you're in a state of fight or flight. So, Gia, this really stirred the pot well. I think this is fantastic.
I have one last thing to say. I just had this thought of like, wow, I wonder how many less mood regulating prescriptions would be written if adults made sure to play, had a commitment to play and a commitment to listen.
Ariel, that was spot on. Yeah.
How did you do that? How you did it again? Is it a sign? Oh, you're playing.
Thanks for watching Get Centered Part 3 Summer Series.
Woo!
Hope to talk to you guys soon.
Go out and play.
Hi, everybody. This is Rav Ariel Schollklapper here with Get Centered. This is part 4 of our summer series. And I'm going to be talking about this pattern that we get into, birth and rebirth. And I want to talk about it because we all want peace. We all really, at the end of the day, we just want to be peaceful and calm. And this birth and rebirth process that we're coming into now, spring, summer, it's this fruition of that birth and rebirth. And so in the context of what I'm talking about, what do I mean by birth and rebirth? I'm talking about this, I think in the second episode we talked with John, we talked about the beginnings of our life and how we form an identity based on the culture around us, what we're being programmed, what's being programmed into us. And from that, a lot of us in our adult life, or the people that I end up like seeing a lot, we come up against these cycles, these patterns, these repeating patterns that keep us trapped. It's like we don't know. That's why we end up in therapy. I was talking about myself too. Is I keep encountering this thing. I keep hitting this same wall over and over and over, and I'm tired of it, right? Or I see that it's causing me a lot of problems, or it's causing the people around me a lot of problems, and I want to move through it and past it. So therapy is the context in which we can start to unravel what those patterns are and maybe where they come from. And I want to say the additional tool that we get in the meditation that supports the therapeutic process is the kind of container, we've talked about that before, that we build for not only the knowledge. First, you have to have the knowledge of the pattern, but then you could get this opportunity that if you can start to work through your practice, you can get a sense of vision and familiarity with what that pattern is and how it's playing out and what starts it, what leads to it, how does it feel when it's happening, and what ultimately resolves it for you. And in that way, you can take this cycle that you're kind of in this birth rebirth series like process where you're kind of like all of a sudden you're angry, and then all of a sudden you're yelling, or all of a sudden you're losing your temper, or right, a lot of people, it's like we're talking about heat and temper, and those are the issues that get us in trouble. Or maybe all of a sudden you're jealous, or one of those hot feelings that makes you lose control. And the issue with those patterns is that when we're out of control in that way, even if we recognize the pattern, a lot of times we might feel powerless to the pattern. And so the practice, I want to talk about a way that we can use the practice to almost use this cycle and this pattern to be the indicator itself. It's like it's utilizing the forces of the pattern and recognition of the pattern to become an indicator that you're misaligned. So let's take the example of anger. If you're finding yourself getting angry often, now you're short fuse, you're losing your temper, maybe you're not letting it out, hopefully you're not, but maybe you are. And you've noticed this keeps happening and I don't like it. And afterwards I keep waking up out of this anger fog dream and like people are mad at me, my kid, like I'm mad at myself. I'm not sure how I got there. I felt out of control while it was happening. And you're saying to yourself in the aftermath, you're saying, how do I not do that again? But then you find yourself again, kind of like in the anger moment again later. And you're like, damn, how did I get here? What's going on? And you go to therapy and we talk about what might be going on. But in the practice, there's this opportunity to insert a wedge and use that pattern and start to really get curious, back to part 3 of this series of playfulness and curiosity, to start to use the play, the curiosity, the stance of witness within you to say, okay, how is this happening, right? Curiosity. Well, what if I did this other thing? Well, how about this other way of trying to treat it? And then you can get intimately aware of what does it feel like when I'm angry, right? What does it feel like before I'm angry, right? Can I start to recognize the feeling that precedes anger and start to work backwards? Like, what can I work backwards from post-anger to within the anger to what happens before the anger, and really get to know these are the things that trigger me. These are the positions this is the conversation that I started, or I feel stressed and that stress is coming out in this other way. And like I'm being angry, but really the thing I'm avoiding is my stress of my upcoming work deadline or taxes coming up or whatever it is. And to be able to recognize, okay, this is not about the anger. This is about the thing that leads me to be so uncomfortable that I would rather be angry. And maybe I learned that as a valid response in my youth, as a way of expressing myself, or that it worked for me somehow. That helped me feel okay in the world. So you get this chance by using the practice. You do it in the lab setting, right? We do it in the meditation setting where you're not active, you're not having a conversation with somebody else, you're not at work, you're in a quiet environment. And we become familiar with what those patterns are, what the stories you tell yourself are, how that amplifies the problem for you. And then you'll be more aware of it when it comes up again in your life. And you'll be able to then choose differently. You get this wedge inserted because of your awareness, because you have the knowledge, and then you also have this vision. You can see it from a kind of like 360. You can start to notice it as it comes up over and over. You get cycled and recycled. You get birthed and rebirthed. You get thrown around by this pattern. And it's like you are out of control in the beginning, and then all of a sudden you become aware you're out of control. And then you have this opportunity through the practice and the awareness, through your vision of what's happening, seeing yourself from the outside a little bit or the inside, to interrupt the pattern. And once you are able to interrupt the pattern, you now have an opportunity to start to integrate new ways of responding to the world. And that's where, like, you cannot separate the play aspect out, because that's uncharted territory. This is back to the concept of, like, even internally, John was talking about these conflicts that when we're shaken loose of our cycle, that the conflict, sometimes it's external, but a lot of times it's also internal. You may feel so uncomfortable, and I'll speak from my own experience. I sometimes feel so uncomfortable with the lack of, like, where to go next. It's like, okay, I've interrupted the anger. Great. Oh crap, now what? It's like, where do I go from here, right? And there's a certain sense of, if I'm playful and curious and I say, well, I don't know, let's see, let's see what comes up, or why don't I just sit and play in the dirt for a minute, right? Or maybe today I'm going to stretch, or I'm going to go get a massage, or I'm going to call a friend who I haven't talked to in a long time. And then you can start to choose purposefully how to reroute yourself out of this pattern. So the birth and rebirth process leads to this. If you can notice it, if you can see this keeps happening, this cycle keeps happening, the story I keep telling myself I keep doing it, and you can interrupt it, then you get this chance to come out of that cycle, which can be vicious. Instead of keep doing it over and over and over, you can start to feel, okay, I do really feel the discomfort, right? It's not that I love losing the game. It's not that I love, getting bad news from a client or whatever it is. It's just that this is what it is, and I don't love it, and I feel it, but I'm not going to get angry, right? Why don't I just see how it feels? Why don't I be curious before it gets angry, to see, like, where is it in my body? And, that's my shoulder. Oh, I've been carrying around this shoulder pain for the last 10 years, And, then you say, okay, well, why don't I go to Leela Scott? Why don't I go talk to somebody who really knows how the meridians work, and have them be able to help me heal that from the inside of my body, so that it has the place to move, so that it doesn't get stuck and locked up in that one particular spot, and help rebalance myself. So there's the elements of the psychological, there's the element of the attention, of like, how do we pay attention, which John sort of in episode 2 talked about as soul in some way. I think it's that guiding light. And then there's also the play, and the physical. The physical, how does it land inside my body? And when we can connect all those pieces, that's the key to this freedom out of the cycle that keeps us so trapped, without us feeling really stuck and not able to move outward from there. So I'm curious what that brings up for y'all.
A lot. I'll go. You're so right. When we notice a behavior, because the emotion in and of itself, right? We don't have a problem with that, right? We've got to have anger. It's got to come out. It's how we express it, right? And who it's affecting in what way. But in terms of just noticing an expression of behavior, we'll use anger since that's the example you used. It's like, okay, now I've noticed it. First step, right? It's always awareness. Now I want to interrupt it, but you're absolutely right. There's this complete vacancy there. You know what I'm saying? Like when you're new to interrupting a pattern like that, what do you put in its place? And I'm just going to quickly, Anna Forrest was one of my biggest influences in yoga. And she talks about this very thing. She's like, people want to quit smoking and they don't know what to do instead, and it's like so basic, but 3 deep breaths. I interrupted anger, pat on the back, way to go, 3 huge breaths. And then, right, you said some things, call a friend, get out in nature, do something else, right? You don't just leave it empty, because then your nervous system doesn't have a new hook, So that was the one thing I wanted to start with. But then the other thing that you said that was so important is that so often what we're doing in this, second half of life, part of life is that it's something that really worked well for us in the first half of life. It really did. And so that's why we're hanging on to it. And that the awareness itself of it, I can imagine, like, when you turn on a flashlight in the darkness and maybe it has a radius of, or diameter of like this far. And then I imagine awareness and consciousness as making that get bigger and bigger. And like we're collecting all these dark aspects of ourselves that were mysterious to us because we were just operating here. And with the curiosity piece of it, getting curious instead of judgmental about whatever it is coming up, I thought of that, the opportunity to kind of ask it questions, asking of the anger, okay, anger can say, I am the part of you that blank, right? Fill in the blank. What I'm here to show you is blank. What I need from you is blank. And now you have a friend, you have an ally in your anger.
I love that. Yeah. When I'm working with a client, those are the kinds of tools that we use in the practice to work with, where's the wisdom there, right? Because it's not broken. It's not bad to have a reactive nature. We want to be alive and, bubbling. We just want to know, like, is this thing trying to get me to do something else? Like, is there something else there? Or like, where is it in my body? Where do you want to hang out? Right? Like, or why are you here? What are you here to teach me? Those are so critical. That curiosity switches the whole game. It's great. Thank you.
That was a great summary of what happens so much in Jungian work, because people have patterns and are often blaming themselves for the patterns, or the patterns are completely unconscious. And when we realize that the patterns are often there out of a necessity of family of origin or an adaptation or whatever, but what you're saying is once we start recognizing the pattern, then there's the personal responsibility of actually doing something about the pattern and stepping out of that. And you're saying the wedge is the way into that. There's a not a great movie, but a movie, Tom Cruise movie, I think called The Day After, something like that. It's a little bit like a video game where you get to a certain point and he dies, then he starts over. And once he realizes the pattern, then it's like, oh, I have to try something different. Otherwise the same thing is going to happen. And then he gets a little farther and then he goes back to the beginning, and then just sort of navigating our way through. And that's pretty much life. Is like, we see a pattern. We see usually two black and white extreme ways of reacting to it that we normally do. And then we stop, like you said, put the wedge, get curious and think, how could I do this differently? How could I imagine? And which is often a trial and error kind of experience, but that we work with it, and that we gradually, like Lila Scott said, our vision and what is illuminated by our consciousness gets wider and wider. But it's a constant process.
Ariel, I was feeling really grateful for your just the way I experienced it when you said makes us lose control, and how that thought, like, control isn't a moral concept, but we do project morality onto it. Like, to stay in control is good. My alcoholism could be a way that I stay in control. And of course, that's a parasitic process. It's sucking me lifeless. So but I just couldn't help but have a pretty visceral response to the ways in which we maintain control. And I appreciate how gently you move into those spaces to help. I love that phrase, right? The wedge, to bring curiosity, and curiosity being the wedge. When it comes to just kind of practical, this is weird, practical advice. Is there anything else to add to how, like, if somebody's going through their regular day and they feel out of control? I know Lila Scott said 3 breaths. What else?
Yeah, the 3 breaths is really strong, right? I think for me, the 3 breaths is if you can do that. I think that the challenge that most people encounter is that they don't even know that it happens until it's already happened. And so that's why it's so important to start to get into the lab space of practice, of the mindfulness practice. It's not because I think that like meditation is like the coolest thing or the best, whatever. It's not for itself. It's because what it does is it is the muscle that you will then need to rely on when you're not meditating to be able to catch yourself. So it's just you're going to the gym and you're going to use this muscle, and then, during the day you're going to go lift a box. It's like they translate into one another. And so that's why I I encourage people to do the practice, not because of the practice itself, but because of the benefit of being able to then catch it when it's happening, or before it's happening, or even after, or even while it's happening, but at least to be able to catch it. That's the hardest part, is being able to actually be aware in the moment. So if you've already caught it, you're already way ahead. You're way ahead of most people. So give yourself a pat on the back, number one, right? Just recognize that's a big deal. I'd say that is the first place to start. It's a big deal that you're able to catch it. Now, if you don't have the tools to know how to operate differently, that's what we do, right? And that's what we explore in our context, is we guide you to find your ways. We may give you some suggestions that are proven, or some tools that may have worked for us or that we've seen work other places, but ultimately every person has to find what fits them. So if you can find that curiosity, if you can find that playfulness in that moment, then you're really way, way ahead. You're kind of like, that's how you really start to super interrupt. But it's not going to be so, my experience is that, first of all, it's a cycle. So expect that it's going to keep coming. You're not going to just resolve it once and for all, probably. Expectations wise, it could, but not always. And then on the other hand, it's saying, this is actually a great place to start. Right now I've recognized it. Now let me see if I can support myself with the tools that I'm going to need in order to be able to interrupt this over and over. So thanks everybody for joining us for this Get Centered Summer Series, part 4 of it. And I hope that if you haven't watched number 1, where we get really an amazing overview of this entire concept, on the many different concepts of how heat interacts with us in this particular time of the year. If you haven't seen episode 2, go watch John, learn about the psychology of how we transform from a young person who soaks up the environment around them to a person who needs to learn how to be themselves in the world, and what challenges that brings up. And then episode 3, where you can hear from Gia all about how play, not only for kids, is so important for us as adults, as all human beings need this in order to grow and to thrive in this world. So hopefully you got some great tools from all of us, and we'll see you next time.